Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Johnny Coker. Earlier this month, President Donald Trump announced his plans to impose 10% tariffs on imports from all countries, as well as, quote, reciprocal tariffs on countries with which the U.S. has the largest trade deficits. Since the announcement, markets have been volatile, and world leaders have been preparing their responses. But what does it all mean for the Borderland region? Joining us to talk about this is Dr. Christopher Erickson, Senior Economic Analyst at NMSU's Arrowhead Center and the founding director of the Center for Border Economic Development. Dr. Erickson, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So I just wanted to ask, what was your initial reaction when you saw the Trump administration announce this next round of tariffs that are being implemented now?
Well, they were much larger than I expected. I think they're much larger than most people expected. Tariffs are very destructive international trade and international relations. It's very hard to find an economist who thinks tariffs are a good idea. In fact, one of the founding fathers of economics is David Ricardo, who made his mark initially as a parliamentarian fighting against the import tariffs on corn into the United Kingdom. And so we economists are generally very opposed to tariffs. Tariffs are only really justified when you're responding to other countries' unfair tariffs.
And this administration, in their release, said that these are about protecting American workers. From your perspective, does the evidence support that claim that this would help American workers and New Mexicans?
Well, it's not going to help American workers in general. It's not going to help American workers in New Mexico. Who it is going to help potentially in the long run over 5 or 6 years or a decade, it will create more manufacturing jobs, and those people who are working in manufacturing will be able to have better opportunities. And there is a segment of our society which has generally fallen behind in the last 25 or 30 years that is the kind of people who would work in those kinds of jobs. And in particular, I'm talking about high school educated white males and then generally high school educated people. But you see that group, that demographic group has fallen behind in terms of income growth and in terms of job opportunities over the last 25 or 30 years. Those are people who voted for Donald Trump. A lot of other people voted for Donald Trump, but those are people who definitely voted for Donald Trump. And these policies potentially could help that group of people. If you look at free trade, what you see happen is high-income industrialized countries like the United States tend to specialize in high-end activities such as product design, software design, that sort of thing. Those are very well-paying jobs, but they are also jobs that have a high skill level, that require a great deal of education, and they're not jobs that typically can be done by people who do not have as good an education. Also, those are jobs that tend to be located in big cities and also on one of the two coasts. Again, I'm talking in generalities, not in specifics. And many of the people who have been left behind are not people that live in those communities on the coast or in big cities. And so, yes, I think that Trump's tariffs potentially could help that group. The problem is that it comes at a very high cost. A study done of the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump on washing machines during his first administration did find that those tariffs created jobs, the kind of jobs I'm talking about for middle class industrial workers, blue collar industrial workers. but at a cost of about $800,000 per job. And we may be seeing the same sort of thing here. We're going to create these jobs, but it's going to be very, very expensive. There are other policies that create these jobs that would not be as expensive. And that's where economists are generally almost, well, I say generally, I'm going to go further and say almost universally opposed to the tariffs that Donald Trump is imposing.
And I want to ask about the Santa Teresa port of entry. That's something that Seabed has done studies on in the past. And you told me a few months ago that within 5 years, it may become the largest source of jobs in the region.
Yes.
So what does all of this now mean for that port of entry from your estimation?
Well, from my estimation, so the port of entry has seen tremendous growth over the last 12 months. It's seen a very large increase in imports coming through and exports going out of the trade port. New Mexico has seen an increase of about 1/3 in exports over the last year, sort of a surge in exports. We've gone from about $9 billion to about $12 billion in exports from New Mexico, most of it going to Mexico, some of it going to China. Of course, the tariffs are on imports, but China today announced a reciprocal tariff on the United States. I think it was 34%, and that tariff on the United States, that's going to impact New Mexico. That's going to reduce our ability to export to China. Mexico is likely to retaliate against the United States. That's going to affect our ability to export to Mexico, and so that's going to have a negative impact on our economy. The average tariff that right now that the United States is imposing is 24%. That's based on today's trade patterns. Those trade patterns, of course, are going to change with the new tariffs. But based on today's trade patterns, the average tariff the United States is imposing is 24%. That's up from about 2% under the Biden administration. And so that sharp increase in tariffs is likely to cut our imports by 1/3. And we can expect if we have a similar retaliation, tit for tat, it'll reduce our exports by 1/3 also. And in New Mexico, that represents about approximately 10%. The decline would be about 3% of our economy. That's enough to push us into a recession right there. That's not to mention the increase in costs for New Mexican consumers and the reduction in profitability for New Mexico businesses. Because, of course, not all the costs are being passed on to consumers. Some will be taken out of profits.
And something I did want to ask about President Trump's, despite being in the president's crosshairs, Mexico in this most recent round of tariffs, USMCA compliant goods will, for the moment, not be hit with any tariffs.
Additional tariffs.
Any additional tariffs,
Right.
of course. So what does this mean for the USMCA moving forward?
Well, that's good. That's good news. That's good news. Because it means that they're not that Canada and Mexico, which already were hit with tariffs earlier last month, they are not going to be seeing more tariffs. That's good news for New Mexico. That's good news because Mexico and New Mexico's largest trading partner by far. About 3/4 of our exports and about the same 3/4 of our imports are from Mexico. And so that is a very positive for New Mexico that we're not getting more tariffs imposed on us. But we have the tariffs that were previously imposed, and those are negative for our economy.
Do you see a world in which these tariffs, do help in some way in terms of maybe not bringing some manufacturing to the United States? You said that was a possibility, but also maybe even nearshoring some of these jobs in Asia to Mexico and having sort of a symbiotic relationship there.
There's a possibility of that. Of course, companies have an incentive to relocate. I have a acquaintance, and I won't be coy. I'll tell you the acquaintance is my son, who runs a toy company, and his toy company, he designs the toys in the United States. That's the high value-added activity. He does the marketing and all that here in the United States. That's the high value-added activity. And then he has them manufactured in China, brings them back and markets them online. And he's attempted to move his products to Vietnam, didn't really work out. He attempted to move them to Mexico, again didn't really work out. And the reason for that is that my son is a small manufacturer. He does not tens of millions, but millions of dollars of business a year, and you have to have a certain kind of business climate that services those kind of small businesses that to really be effective. And the only place you really have that is currently in China. It's starting to develop in Vietnam. It may develop in some other countries, but right now China is the place that has the infrastructure for doing this small run manufacturing, like what my son needs for his business model to work. Of course, they have these large imports on China. That gives even more incentive for my son to try to relocate somewhere. And again, I mentioned that Vietnam might be the obvious second choice. But of course, the problem with that is that the tariffs on Vietnam are, I think, second highest in the world under the Trump tariffs. So that's probably not going to be an option for him. Can he find a manufacturer in Mexico that can do it? Well, again, he's looked before and hasn't found someone who can do it because of the small runs that he's doing. And in Mexico, they tend to specialize in much bigger industrial customers, not the small fries like my son. And so it's very difficult to relocate things. Very difficult to relocate things. That's not to say that it won't happen. In fact, those blue-collar jobs that we should expect to see being created will partially be created by domestic U.S. companies expanding, by existing foreign companies that are already in the U.S. expanding, and then also by some companies reshoring to the United States. Some companies might reshore also to Mexico, which would be beneficial for us here on the border.
And going off of that, I suppose for folks who own small businesses, especially those importing parts and materials, what kind of advice would you give them right now to be able to bear the brunt of all the fallout of these initial imposed tariffs?
Tighten your belt. The good news is that everybody's facing these tariffs, so that means that everyone's going to be forced to raise their prices. So you may not lose as many of your customers as you expect, but the reality is that it's very likely that these businesses will have to eat into their profits, that they won't be able to pass on all of the costs to consumers. And this is what we call the incidence of the tax. How much of the tax is paid by the business, and how much is passed on to the consumer. And that's a very complicated. It's different for every product. It depends on the market conditions, on supply and on demand. Is it a monopoly? Is it competitive? All these things impact, and every product has to be evaluated differently. But most businesses will be able to pass some of the costs on. Most businesses will have to take some of the decline in profit.
And do you think that the current state of the economy, do you think that we'll see maybe sort of a bubble burst, or seeing a lot of businesses closing down because they simply can't afford to be in operation anymore?
I think you'll see a lot of businesses that have the kind of business model I was talking about, where you're importing from China to sell online. Those businesses are going to have a difficult time. I talked to my son about whether he thinks he's going to survive, and he thinks he is. He's kind of come up with a plan. But I think there will be other companies that are right on the edge. They won't be able to do it. There'll be some companies that do this kind of a business that are maybe not the the main source of income for the family, and they'll just decide to shut down. But it's not good news. I think the more important thing is, if we tip the country into a recession, which I think is likely, if we tip the country into recession, that recession will have more of an impact on businesses than the tariffs directly, at least in the short run. And so that recession, if we have one, and I think it likely at this point, better than 50-50 chance in the next 12 months we'll start a recession.
Wow.
That will inevitably lead to bankruptcies, business closings, and of course layoffs.
Mm-hmm. And some folks have been saying that these tariffs are being used as a negotiation tactic. Maybe the current administration will take off the tariffs once they get what they want out of these countries, essentially. Do you see that as a potential, or?
Well, I imagine that is what the plan is to negotiate some sort of long-term solution that's not quite as draconian as what we have now.
Right. Do you see that as beneficial in the long term, using those as a negotiation tactic?
Well, it's hard to say, because what we're seeing here is an end of globalization, and it's a loss of faith internationally in the United States as a reliable partner in international affairs, whether it's working through NATO or international trade. The tariffs are specifically about international trade, but it's also NATO and the Ukraine and all these other things put together. And I think President Trump is, and I think if you asked him, he would agree. He is not an internationalist. He thinks that we have been taken advantage of in the international arena. And yet, if you look at globalization and the benefits from globalization, they've been tremendous. We've had this 80-year period since the end of World War II. We've had increasing globalization and integration, and all we've seen is global poverty rates drop like a rock. The United States has grown year after year. We've had the longest period. Now, of course, we don't have the high growth of these less developed countries that are doing catch-up, but we have had a consistent, solid growth pretty much continuously since the mid-'80s. I know there's been a couple of hiccups, a big one being COVID and another big one being the housing bubble. But if you put that in long-term perspective, this has been among the most consistent periods of solid growth in the United States history. And that can be that can be explained in part by our increasing globalization, the reduction in cost of production from global integration and utilizing global supply chains, and then also the increase in the customer base as many people in other countries are raising out of poverty and becoming consumers. You know, the absolute poverty is adjusted for inflation is about $265 a day per person. In 1980, half the world was in absolute poverty. Today, it's dropped to 8.3%, and that can be explained almost completely by globalization, about India becoming part of the global network, about China becoming part of the global network, and those huge countries, 2.5 billion people, rising out of poverty and becoming, if not middle class, at least not, but at least not literally starving. And to think that that's a bad thing, I think, is wrong-headed. And the United States, I want to emphasize, has benefited from this tremendously, not just other countries. However, China in particular, because they're a big trading partner, hasn't been playing fair. That's been pretty well documented, and it's pretty easy to see, if you just think about it. If you engage in free trade and your partner engages in unfair trade that benefits them at your cost, that's not beneficial to you, that you can be taken advantage of in that situation. And that justifies tariffs on China, which President Trump initiated, President Biden continued. And I think that those are justified when you have that kind of situation, but it's hard to see how that justifies, how you can use the same logic to justify the very, very high tariffs on Vietnam that were just imposed.
When we look back on this in, say, 10, 20 years, do you think this will be a significant mark for the U.S. economy?
I think this is good. This is going to be a watermark event in economic history to the Bretton Woods Accord at the end of World War II that established the international system with the United States as the reserve currency. It's equivalent to Nixon going off the gold standard. Very, very significant event in global economic history.
Do you think that these tariffs are an effective tool? Because you mentioned, some of those earlier tariffs on China potentially being justified. Would you say it that way?
Yeah.
Do you think they are an effective tool in terms of changing the balance of trading partnerships?
Well, they are. If your goal is to change if your goal is to eliminate trade deficits, which is one of the stated goals President Trump has discussed, they are a tool for doing that. The problem is it's using a sledgehammer when a scalpel would have been less costly to use.
And we talked a little bit about reducing the trade deficits, and you said maybe there are different ways to address these things economically. What alternative strategies could be employed to achieve similar outcomes that this administration?
So the first thing to remember is that the bilateral trade deficits, which is what's been the focus of this policy, are really not important. What's important is the aggregate trade deficit, the trade deficit of the United States with the world, not with China or Mexico. And the way that you overcome those is by depreciating the currency. When you depreciate the currency, and the way you can do that is by lowering interest rates relative to other countries, by lowering our and when you depreciate the currency in real terms, meaning not after adjusting for inflation, when the currency depreciates, that makes our goods less expensive compared to foreign goods, and that would attract and that would help us to export more. There's also things you can do. Like making it easier to export by removing regulations on exports, by reducing, so simply to reduce the cost, the cost at the border to exit the country. There are things like that you can do. It is not a necessarily easy thing to do, but you also have to think about whether it's desirable. People hear deficit and they think it's bad. But remember that deficit has a flip coin, which is foreigners investing in our country, providing us funds. They either buy our currency and hold them as reserves because they value the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, or they buy our stocks and bonds, or they take the dollars they get and they use them to invest in our country by building, say, factories like. Many of the automobile manufacturers around the world have U.S. automobile plants, and there are other companies invest in the United States, and so it really is a vote of confidence by the world that they're willing to invest in our country, and when they invest in our country, they pay for that investment. They're using the dollars they get by selling things to us to invest in our country, and that's a good thing, generally speaking. I was a history major as an undergraduate, so I can't help myself. How did we build the railroads? And the answer is by the British investing in our railroads. The British basically financed the railroads in the United States in the mid-19th century. The Continental Railroad and other railroads that were associated with that time period. So we've always relied on foreign investment for our growth.
And we don't have a ton of time left, but I did want to get your take on this. Historically, the Republican Party has been pro-free trade, very much laissez-faire capitalism, and yet now we have a Republican president who is putting all these restrictions on free trade and tariffs on what would generally be considered free trade movement. What is your take on all that?
Well, my take on that is Donald Trump has thrown everything up in the air, and it's come down in a different configuration. The Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan. We have a new resorting of the parties, and now the Republican Party is people say it's the party of Trump, but that's too simplistic. It is the party that Donald Trump created, but he's creating it in response to political influences. And again, I'm talking about the blue collar worker who has not been keeping up as the economy has grown, has not benefited from globalization in as much as many other people in the country have. That as I say, we should be doing things to help people who are not keeping up, but there are less costly ways to do it than the way that is being proposed by President Trump.
Well, Dr. Erickson, unfortunately we're out of time, but I really appreciate you coming in to give us all this insight.
I love having talks like this.
No,
Thank
absolutely, and we'll have to get you back in again because as we move forward, I'm sure there will be more to talk about. So thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For all of us here at KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Fronteras, A Changing America.